Where am I looking?
Introduction. The three of you.
Hey, where am I looking? Where am I looking?
That camera, right here.
Right there. Perfect.
I need.
Sound check.
Yep.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Next.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Go again.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, good. Next.
10, 9, 7, 8.
Do it again.
I'm gonna fall asleep during the anesthesia.
Keep talking.
What? Keep going.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That's good. And next.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, one more.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Welcome to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Heather Conley. I'm president, and we have an exceptionally timely, important conversation on the importance of NATO's cybersecurity posture and its importance of focusing on emerging technology. NATO has been working very diligently on providing the cyber capabilities and the resilience needed. In 2016, NATO declared cyber as a domain of operations. Later in 2019, it developed a comprehensive cyber defense policy. So NATO has been focusing on this in an enormous way. And we have, of course, this conversation at an incredibly timely moment because yesterday, the Department of Justice just released a major operation, Operation Medusa, that was helping to protect the US and our allies against a Russian malware known as Snake. So perhaps we will get into that conversation a little bit. This conversation is bringing important voices to the conversation. First and foremost, our great friend at GMF, Mircea Geoană, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and another great friend of GMF, Ann Neuberger, who is Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. Our colleagues are joined by Ambassador Karen Kornblum, GMF's own Managing Director on All Digital. You're in for a great conversation. So welcome to GMF. Thank you for joining us. And let's turn to this great conversation. Karen, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. I'm Karen Kornblum. As Heather said, I'm Managing Director, GMF Digital, and former U.S. Ambassador to the OECD. And we are thrilled to have these distinguished speakers today. I'll just introduce them again. Mircea Geoană is NATO Deputy Secretary General. He has a distinguished international career on behalf of his home country of Romania. Ann Neuberger is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. She served previously in many senior roles at the National Security Agency, most recently as Director of Cybersecurity. I want to start by talking about Ukraine. And it's been hailed as perhaps the most effective cyber defense in history. NATO began cooperating with Ukraine even before the Russian invasion. Can you tell us a little bit about what made it successful? And then, Anne, if I may, I'll turn it to you about lessons that we've learned and how we can apply them going forward.
No, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be back at the GMF. You know, my deep affection and gratitude for your great organization, keeping transatlantic community strong, has been and it's our strong interest. And also, not to speak, the pleasure to be again with Anne. I mean, she's a formidable leader, and we have done so many things together. This is just the start. No, you're right. After the illegal occupation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine came towards us in NATO and also to Western partners and allies to try to strengthen their national security capabilities, training militaries, learning about the sophistication of cyber domain, trying to move away from the Soviet era philosophy of national security, and basically trying to move closer to the West. And I think it paid off. To give you an example of a one great ally, only Canada alone has trained more than 30,000 Ukrainian troops since 2014 until now, and not to speak of the immense support from the US and from other allies to helping Ukraine. What I'll put as an observation at the beginning, that Ukraine is showcasing something that we knew, but we see it in real dramatic action, that the line between peace, conflict, and war, when it comes to cyber and to other domains, is becoming blurred. So there is a sort of a continuum of a sort of a permanent struggle. And this is happening in Ukraine. It's happening against the Republic of Moldova, where Russia uses a full warfare hybrid toolbox. So I think the first observation is that they were readier, and this is very clear that it's a cross-domain operation. The second thing, and also Anne and the US government has helped us and Ukraine tremendously well, is the indispensable cooperation with industry. And we know that just before February 24th, when this infamous invasion started, the Russians tried to cripple, and they crippled the satellites for communications for Ukraine. And without private sector, on cyber, on telecommunications, on satellite, probably will be very difficult for Ukraine to be as successful as they are. And the third, empirical observation at the beginning of our conversation is that, of course, we look at Ukraine, but cyber attacks against NATO countries, against democracies all over the world need a specific kind of response. And here I'm very proud that under Anne's strong leadership, we started to have the first annual national cyber coordinators in all NATO countries. So once a year we meet, once a year we decide, and we are now ready to have a cyber virtual response team in NATO to help countries and partners in front of this very complex and pervasive threat to our security.
Thank you. And so Ukraine has obviously shown the extent to which our adversaries will be using cyber attacks in future geopolitical crises. What are the lessons that you and under your leadership, the US is learning for future conflicts?
Absolutely. So first, as Mircea said, it's wonderful to be here at GMF, and it's wonderful to be here together because we talked frequently over the time, certainly even in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but very much so afterwards, in building the operational ties and in really building real capability, both to respond to threats, to partner with the private sector, to determine how we ensure that for the long term, and that's what I'll talk about, we can deter and build capability against these threats for today's technologies and for tomorrow's as well. So in terms of lessons learned, I think we talk about three specifically: defense, deterrence, and the third would be driving international norms. So on the defense side, fundamentally, as Mircea noted, Russia's invasion of Ukraine highlights that, and the use of cyber throughout, beginning with that cyber attack on satellite systems literally in the days before, highlights how much cyber attacks have become a part of crisis and conflict in terms of destabilizing the situation, in terms of trying to make a population put pressure on, in this case, Ukrainians, in that way. So first on the defense side, building the ties at NATO to spread information regarding threat information regarding cyber attacks, threat intelligence regarding potential cyber attacks, how to defend against it, and ensuring that NATO was a central place for that information to fuse through. So for example, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we contacted key cybersecurity companies and said, if you see any destructive capabilities, we were very concerned about a repeat of the NotPetya incident that had occurred the last time Russia illegally occupied Ukraine, in terms of a cyber attack that spread with impact around the world. So we conveyed to the companies, immediately notify us if you see anything destructive. And indeed, when a first call came in, Mircea and I talked, and we ensured that via NATO, that information was rapidly passed to multiple NATO members' governments. And then, of course, working with the private sector, they were able to rapidly deploy defenses. So that's across both the intelligence and the defensive capability. The second piece of that is the deterrence. Obviously, defense builds deterrence. If you're more capable, if you've put on your alarm systems and locked your doors, you are deterring attacks in a more capable way. But also the knowledge that we would work together rapidly, and that really a capability in attack against one would be viewed as a broader attack against the group. And I think related to that is driving international norms. Under Mircea's leadership, NATO did really the first public exposure of, in this case, it was Iran's cyber attack against Albania. And the goal of that was to say, we've been pressing for a responsible framework for countries, for states in cyberspace. Under the UN, there are a set of accepted international norms regarding conducting disruptive attacks against critical infrastructure. The big part of those norms is actually implementation of them and consequences if they're violated. We're taking steps towards that. The first key step is as a group of countries calling out activity as quickly as we can afterwards and naming the actor. NATO did its first attribution for the Albania cyber attacks that really disrupted their government to Iran, put out information regarding that as part of those key steps of driving international norms.
Can you follow up about that a little bit? Because cyber norms is something that we've all been talking about for years and years and years. And now you're saying there are going to be consequences for violation of those norms. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the hurdles that had to be surmounted in order to go from writing norms on a piece of paper to actually making them a reality? Maybe, Anne, you want to start? Yeah.
So I'll start and then would welcome the thought. So international norms in any area are, as you noted, a series of steps. First comes the discussion to say what's appropriate in this arena. We have norms for international laws of the sea. What's appropriate in the area of cyberspace, which is particularly complex because many of our critical infrastructure, many countries are owned and operated by the private sector. So that adds additional complexity. But under the UN Governmental Group of Experts, there were a set of norms that were codified in 2015, voluntary norms, and then restated again in 2019. And those include norms like countries won't interfere in each other's computer emergency response teams' operations. Countries won't harbor entities conducting disruptive attacks against critical infrastructure. Because those were voluntary norms, the key was then, how do you make them accepted practice? A big step of that is countries reinforcing those norms. That's why attribution is so important. Yeah. And that's why attribution with as many countries as we can gather is so important. And then the final piece is consequences. And the question is always, what are appropriate consequences? Clearly that varies on the impact of a given attack. And that's where a lot of the international discussion is. That's why within NATO, the fact that when Albania was disrupted, when Albania's government operations were disrupted via a cyber attack, it was so important that NATO conveyed, and that attribution stated this was, and did that first step towards making these norms truly accepted internationally.
You know, the beauty of NATO is that we are an immense convening platform.
Yes.
And once in our cyber policy, we have also, like for every policy, for AI and what to do on biotech or quantum, we always have a piece of responsible use and international norms. And of course, as Anne was rightly saying, this is a very complex domain to be regulated anyway, because it's so specific. And also, we don't see eye to eye across the world. Mm-hmm. But once the 1 billion people in 31, soon to be 32 allies in NATO, a conglomerate of nations that have more than 50% of global GDP, and so much innovation power and so much influence, directly or indirect, around the world, the moments when NATO adopts a norm, it becomes a standard, and that standard is considered, even by the ones who don't like NATO that much, a few of those still exist, that this is the gold standard. And I reach out to many partners, from Australia all the way to our interlocutors, let's say in Ghana, everybody recognizes that NATO is a gold standard for everything we do. And then, of course, there's the issue of legal norms. And we have a very powerful, again, convening power in NATO. When we adopted cyber as an operational domain, as Heather has said at the beginning, we also convened our top lawyers, our counselors. And now we have also identified that a severe attack, we don't define specifically what does it mean severe, because we want to have a little bit of flexibility and also to have some cards that we hold to the chest. But a severe cyber attack could trigger Article 5. And that's why most of these cyber attacks are below the Article 5, and that's why we work together. And again, US leadership and as leadership is formidable into this. So there are norms, but for most of the new technologies, we don't have norms, international norms. And this is why it is so important to work also through NATO, to work also the European Union, because they also have capacity to regulate. And I think if you look US, NATO, EU, it's already a massive constellation of nations, and our partners, our allies across the world are eventually following. And then we have critical mass of beginning of international norms also on cyber.
So following up on that, what is the virtual rapid response cyber capability? Sorry, tripping over my words.
We both smile at this question. So go ahead.
I'll explain why we're both smiling. So, this was, in terms of naming it, and I'll explain what it is, that was a term that, the team identified clearly defines what it is. And then, NATO hosted a Cyber Pledge conference, which we'll talk more about in Rome a few months ago. And across the NATO members, multiple countries, truly everyone, struggled with the acronym VCISC. So finally at the table, we said, we're reaching NATO agreement. We're now calling it an virtual response capability. We're simplifying it. So that's why we smiled, because so many people were struggling.
Good.
So we said, okay, this is one problem we can quickly solve. Let's do it. So, building on the work where the team convened lawyers to say, what is considered an attack? What we recognized was that the members of NATO all have capability to respond to an incident. Some have vulnerability researchers, some have skilled legal teams, some have skilled communicators, some have people who can rapidly bring back systems. And that in the event of an incident among a NATO member, we needed a way for NATO to quickly coordinate which capabilities countries would make available and then exercise them together so we could seamlessly really fuse that support to any NATO member who requested it. And that's the kind of maturing we're talking about here, where we had the high-level theoretical concepts, but we've built the operational muscle now so that NATO truly does operate as a team. And at the upcoming Vilnius summit, we'll actually be announcing that capability now exists. It's been 18 months of really hard work from when the idea was first discussed to where we gained agreement at that first really conference of NATO cyber defense heads with Mircea chaired. All countries then agreed, yes, this was something to do. Then we asked countries who would like to bring capability to bear, knowing that there will always be some countries who are more capable than others, and it would be a really effective way to build capacity among the weaker NATO members. Countries have now committed and will discuss and announce the stand-up of the formal capability, as I mentioned at Vilnius this summer, which is exciting because it represents both ensuring a way that we can rapidly respond and also build capacity in a real way.
And this is voluntary. So how will you bring the various countries into action on this virtual response?
The fact that we are convening all the national cyber coordinators in one place in NATO is in itself, and we approve by consensus such a new capability in NATO, it's an indication of the willingness of allies to contribute. And of course, what Anne was saying is very, very important. Of course, you have the US or you have bigger NATO allies with, let's say, wealthier, more capabilities. That's a fact of life. But again, the beauty of NATO that we can bring together, from Estonia all the way to Romania, and from the Czech Republic all the way to the Netherlands, and from Spain and Portugal everywhere to Finland and Sweden. They also bring tremendous capabilities, by the way. So the only political hurdle that we had is the fact, and this is where Anne's leadership was so important and our common effort was important, because these are very precious national assets.
Yes.
These are things that you work hard. They cost money. Talent is not always available. You have to make sure that you fund America and you fund Romania or you fund Estonia or Albania for that matter. But I think we understand that in such a complex world, we need also to pull resources together. And then again, there's the beauty of NATO. Doesn't mean that someone, a precious asset, a professional, a technology or a private sector capability will leave that place. It's virtual. So it's earmarked. And when and if a situation occurs, we mobilize from the vast contributions from all allies, and we go and to help next time Albania, next time whoever else. And that's, I think, this is the beauty of this exercise, which I think is also strengthening NATO. Because in more traditional deterrence and defense, things are a bit easier. As we speak, we are undergoing the most significant transformation of our deterrence and defense and command structure and planning and doctrines in NATO in generations. But on these new technologies and cyber, things are a bit fuzzier and more difficult to put resources together. So that's, I think, I see this success that we had together as a sort of a precursor, as an icebreaker for many other similar things to come on new technologies, on AI, on quantum, on biotech. And I think I see this as a sort of a pioneer of a new way in which NATO is adapting to a new security landscape, classical and non-classical defense or national security.
I'd love to talk about the new technologies in a second, but I wanted to ask Anne about NATO's extension from sort of threat detection to rapid cyber response is an enormous change. Can you tell us also about this cyber defense pledge?
Yes, I referenced that earlier when I talked about the Rome Cyber Defense Pledge Conference, which NATO hosted. And the goal there is to say really two components, building on the NATO strategic concept, building on the pledge for overall both defense capability, taking that into the cyber arena in two core ways. One is to say, what kind of capabilities, again, as we just talked about, will countries bring to that core NATO coordination mechanism? And second, countries will make commitments regarding what they're doing to secure core parts of their critical infrastructure, water and power systems. Again, if a NATO member's water and power systems, critical services that citizens rely on, don't have adequate cybersecurity to meet the realities we started with, right? Where we expect in a crisis or conflict, cyber attacks will become a reality, then we've left doors unlocked. Yeah. We've left windows unchecked. So the goal is to say that countries commit to those minimum cyber defense practices that we've, frankly, in the United States now made mandatory during the Biden administration for those few key sectors where if services are disrupted, it impacts the citizens of those countries in a very fundamental way.
Yes, we also say, which is a universal saying, that we are as strong as our weakest link. So when we do cyber pledge or when we do resilience in NATO, the fact that we are learning from each other. So individual ally nations commit to some form of goals, but then there is a sort of a very interesting dynamic because you tend to learn from the ones who are doing better than yourself. And I think this is a self-reinforcing, virtuous cycle of permanent adaptation. And one word about what I would call the super horizontal role of cyber, because I don't think we can put cyber in one silo and resilience in one silo and multi-domain operations in NATO in one silo and so on and so forth. So this is in our digitalized world. This is the most transversal thing that we have. And Anne was rightly saying, look at Ukraine. They are attacking civilian infrastructure. They're disrupting energy grids. They're trying to destroy power plants. Yeah. They try to do this kind of things. So this is a way for us to really understand that cyber defense and cyber adaptation and cyber resilience is probably the most fundamental piece of a foundation of our national security in America and across NATO. That's why we take this very seriously. And that's why we need so much American leadership and all allies' contributions into this very important topic.
Thank you. And you touched on it, the cyber strategy that the Biden administration has announced. Can you talk a little bit about that and about the international portion specifically and how that fits into the cyber pledge and also to what you're doing with NATO?
I'll kick that off, and then I know Mircea will talk a bit about Diana, which that ties to. So very much so. So the cybersecurity strategy really, one, focuses on securing critical infrastructure because of a recognition that in crisis or conflict, an adversary country may seek to disrupt critical services, and we need to have confidence as a government that the services our citizens rely on are secure. So that ties to the cyber defense pledge you just asked about a moment ago, Karen. I think a second key element of the strategy is how we work with the private sector and how we do so in a way both for today's technology and in driving use of emerging tech and secure emerging tech in that way as well. And that's really represented in very much in NATO's work on Diana, which is an emerging tech accelerator, a focus to say, how does NATO work with the private sector, startups, to bring them in to address NATO's needs across the platform, specifically dual use needs, right? And Diana is very much focused on 9 key technologies, which mirror very much the strategic technologies we're focused on here in the US, from quantum to advanced manufacturing to biotech, certainly to AI as well, and to establishing a NATO Innovation Fund to jumpstart that work, which I'll leave to Mircea to talk about more. So fundamentally, the elements of the strategy, securing critical infrastructure, working with the private sector responsibility for securing some of those technologies, and then that everything we do will be, as President Biden has talked about so many times, working with international partners hand in glove from the beginning, because we recognize that that is the way we want to both take on opportunity and address threats.
Terrific. And yes, I did want to ask you exactly about what we're doing with these emerging technologies, with AI, with quantum, where the threats are only going to increase. And there's, as you said, so much of the cyber defense depends on interaction, shared communication, cooperation with the private sector. So can you tell us what NATO is doing in that respect?
Listen, when I started my job of NATO in 2019, Secretary General Stoltenberg asked me to come in his office. I said, Mircea, I have a job for you other than doing everything you should do for our alliance. I want to be the champion of innovation in NATO. I said, said, yes, boss, of course. That's ordering, marching
first
orders.
Answer.
But then I started to look into the complexity of what the technological industrial revolution, the plural, are bringing to our national security, our national interest, and to our societies and our democracies, because we cannot separate national security from economic security and for societal resilience. So that's we start to work very much on this new, what we call emerging disruptive technologies. Some of them are disrupting, but not that new anymore. They're not emerging. They're maturing very, very fast. So what we do is basically we take each of these technologies and we transform them into NATO policies. Give you the AI and big data example. When we decided a few months back on this new NATO policy on AI and big data, we also attached a big portion of responsible use, because the trust of our citizens is the fundamental issue in our democracies. Our competitors or systemic rivals, name it as you want, don't have that concern, because they have a fusion between state and the economy, military and intelligence in one piece, while we have to make sure that we keep all these things together. Number one. Second, I believe, as a Romanian this time, that as powerful Silicon Valley is, and I just visited a few days back just to present Diana, or the Boston huge cluster on biotech, or Austin, or Arizona, or so many places where America innovates, or UK or Canada. There is so much untapped talent across the NATO countries in the triple helix between government, private sector, and academia. And that's my job as the champion of innovation in NATO on behalf of Secretary General Stoltenberg, to harness this talent of innovation. I was in London the other day opening the European headquarters of Diana, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, 100 test centers and accelerators from all NATO countries, helping startups develop dual-use technologies. And I would say at the Imperial College, when we have the European office, I think it's the flagship store of NATO. You see no guards at the entrance. It's just a university, a campus. when you see NATO working with the triple helix. And I want to thank again Anne, because she's running not only cyber, but also new technologies for the help we've got. And also something which is the innovation fund in NATO, which is not huge, but is the first of its sort, is the first venture capital, multinational sovereign fund. Sounds tension in what I say. It was until we realized that we need also to put some trusted capital through Diana, startups, a little bit of trusted capital from NATO, and then these more mature technologies and startups go to the real market, to the real venture capital market, to the real big tech market, and flourish. Because this is the strength of NATO and of our democracies, that we have so much innovation and talent. And again, this can come from Finland and Sweden all the way to Estonia or Romania. It's everywhere, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, everywhere, in Albania. There is so much talent. And one thing about the former communist countries, because social sciences was so much infected by ideology, that exact sciences were the only place who could really do something real. So that's why I was so good at math, of IT. My country, Romania, has the highest number of IT graduates per capita in Europe, because in a way we are somehow forced. And that's why Ukrainians, their ingenuity also comes from a very solid sciences education for our Ukrainian friends. So I'm saying that I'm exceptionally excited. So 4 years ago, when Jens gave me this job, I said, wow, now I say thank you so much, because I learned so much. And I think I'm a better leader now, understanding the complexity of innovation.
There's a larger story in there, that when we get requests that seem really hard to do what you did and say, yes, I'll do it, and then good things happen.
So picking up on this idea that national security, economic security, innovation are so closely connected, Jake Sullivan gave a speech the other week at Brookings, where he talked about industrial strategy and how central technology is now. And, you know, certainly the U.S. is still a leader, or the leader perhaps, in industrial technologies. And but it's always a little bit of a challenge for the government and the technology sector to work together. There's a healthy tension there. What is the U.S. doing in terms of the same kind of thing that we were just talking about with NATO, making sure that we're working with the tech sector on getting ahead of the cyber challenges?
Yeah. So as you noted, Jake talked about this industrial strategy, and the point was to say that there are foundational technologies that shape our economic growth, that are core to our security, and that in some cases, private sector investment won't necessarily drive those outcomes we need in that way. So he talks about deploying public capital in a way to jumpstart that private sector investment, to crowd in private sector investment, not to replace it in any way, but to help channel and shape it. And I'll give an example of that in telecommunications. Telecommunications, there is a foundational technology. It's foundational because look at all of us. We have how many smartphones at home? We have any number of smart devices. And that data fundamentally moves around the world on telecommunication networks. Building upon that are artificial intelligence applications that can learn from that data to generate new insights. From smart manufacturing, it's really cool what you can do in auto manufacturing plants, where robotics are essentially talking to systems, but you need adequate telecom and you need the tech to be advanced enough to do that. In the United States, there aren't major traditional telecom equipment manufacturers, largely because of heavy Chinese subsidies of their players, heavy playing in standards bodies that really crowded out many other countries and many other companies in those countries. So some of the things we've been doing to say telecom is exactly as Jake talked about, right? Core to our economic growth, certainly core to our national security, both in deflecting the risk of espionage and protecting against an adversary disrupting communications in a time of crisis. Things we have been doing, for example, you've seen the Commerce Department's wireless fund as part of the CHIPS Act, $1.5 billion to kind of jumpstart technology in that area. You've seen things, for example, that Exim, the Export-Import Bank, recently changed their rules around being able to finance 5G opportunities around the world. Our cooperation with the European Union to talk about how do we ensure trusted technologies can compete. And then finally, work we've been doing to jumpstart a task force between US and India, both governments and key telecom players, to really jumpstart the rollouts of advanced and interesting technologies in the areas of 5G. So that gives an example of that, and it builds very much on what Mircea was describing in terms of a similar concept in terms of Diana, which says there are foundational technologies, certainly very much the same there, and a recognition that we can bring to bear that cooperation from government investment funds to jumpstart private sector interest and to ensure we maintain that trusted leadership in that space.
This is a fundamental conversation, and this is not only about our competitors, but it's about us.
Yes.
As free societies and open markets and freedom lovers. So even the 50s and the 60s, we all remember or we read, let's say in documentaries, that 90% of all innovation that was used in national security was produced by government. And the US government was an example of trickling down from that defense or national security driven innovation into the civilian thing, into the markets. And then you see, Kevlar and the tennis rackets, everything moving from the NASA program. Now, after many decades, 90% of the same technology are produced by the private sector, only 10% by governments. And this is great because innovation is happening in the private sector. But also we have to find a way for these foundational technologies to have a more anticipatory conversation between government, including my organization, NATO, and private sector, and academia and civil society, our citizens and our researchers, and to try to find a better balance, because there is a tension, there is a difficulty many times for governments to regulate or try to regulate nationally, and even more so internationally, this kind of new technologies, because there is a little bit of lack of constant dialogue. And if the private sector will hear from governments or from NATO or whoever else in my line of work, which are our expectations, which are our concerns, where we think national security will look like in the next few years, I think they will learn. It's good for business because that's a growing market. In Vilnius at my summit, our summit, will have 2% of GDP for defense, I hope, for all allies. You see Japan spending 2% of GDP for defense. That's huge. Germany, 2% for defense is huge, big economies. So I think it's now in a way for us to redefine in another very easy conversation, which is the new equilibrium, which is not stifling innovation by over-regulating, that's bad. But also if we don't do, a couple of responsible conversation with a win-win logic with the private sector, then it will be very difficult for us to do this. So I think this is a fundamental thing. I mentioned that China has a fusion between state and economy. We cannot imitate that because it's not us. But we have to find a better way to build upon the huge synergies that we have all among our democracies, starting with America, going all the way to the rest of NATO allies and America's allies around the world, and find a better way for us to be consistent and to provide. That's one. The second thing, that there will be a premium on economic security, not on defense, but resilience, supply chain, microprocessors, all these things that we are now discovering, energy security, space assets. So this will be a price. And we better be honest with the private sector that there will be a premium that needs to be covered somehow. And we better have this discussion together, because like the CHIPS Act, you can use incentives. You can do some, the fiscal, the taxation part. So together, I think we are much stronger, and I strongly encourage, and that's also, again, the beauty of NATO, is that we can bring, with the power of convening of NATO, private sector, governments, and academia in one conversation, and try to get out stronger, more innovative, and also more robust when it comes to our national security. I think that's the essence of the conversation in our free, democratic, liberal democracies and free capitalism that we embody.
I think this is a really underappreciated, enormous shift that has happened the last 2 years, even 1 year, to this understanding of the resilience needs in the economic sphere.
I don't think that a few years back, there would be any discussion that the big tech would come to the White House to discuss about AI and this thing. So I think also private sector realizes that economic security is here to stay with us, and resilience is important also for their business and for their customers, and for us as governments and international organizations, for our citizens and for our national interest. So I'm confident, I'm optimistic that we'll be finding this new, if you want, equilibrium, which is dynamic, sometimes in contradiction, because we don't always see eye to eye, but talk in earnest and talk early. Talk early. When you see the seeds of a new technology, we are also looking into the future, not only in today's technologies. We are seeing weak signals for new materials to be invented outside of the Mendeleev table. We are talking about synthetic biology. We are talking about so many things that are happening as we speak. So we better look from now to things that are maturing today. Quantum is maturing today and tomorrow. Others are coming probably in the next few years. But I think we'd better learn the lesson from this discussion and make sure that next time around we do a better job and earlier, not to try to run behind the curve, but to lead the conversation, including eventually on international norms when there is possible to do that.
And I'll give two practical examples of this in a technology perspective. So one is, as we looked at advanced telecommunications, as you know, we hosted an event on 6G, bringing together key companies, key universities, key government partners to talk about how do we work together and to ensure that these telecommunications are secure and to ensure that we have trusted leadership in them. In a very practical way, one of the things we heard from telecom operators was we're all doing independent testing and we're learning different things. It's very helpful if there are grants to stand up test beds where we can all bring technologies to bear, learn from what we're learning so that we can all bring down, frankly, the cost of testing. We can learn from each other's scale and more rapidly deploy these technologies across our very complicated existing systems. That's a great example where government facilitation of something enables more rapid transition to more advanced tech. A second great example in the NATO context is quantum, building on that point. One of the, a nuclear bomb for cybersecurity is an adversary getting a quantum computer that can break the encryption that is the foundation of all cybersecurity. We're beginning a transition to post-quantum cryptography in the United States. And the conversations we have with NATO, because clearly we share secure operations, secure communications when NATO is coordinating operations with multiple allies, when we have a task force. Those are fundamentally NATO systems in which we're securely communicating. That transition to post-quantum cryptography will be a key example of where technology advancement and rollout will be coordinated. And we're, to that point, the weakest link is the link to all. Because if one last partner who hasn't transitioned, the system always goes down to the lowest level of security unless we make a decision to say a partner won't participate, which of course is not something we want to do. So that just shows the linkage between emerging technology operations and how foundational that is to what we seek to do in the NATO alliance, which is deter advanced threats.
I would also encourage our universities, our young researchers to be much closer together. And I think Diana, which hosts in many of the test centers, accelerators that are offered by allies to Diana, to NATO, I think many of those are in universities. And of course, those universities themselves have their own international networks and also their own innovation ecosystems. Some of them are huge, like Stanford or MIT or other big. I'm giving the commencement speech at Virginia Tech on Sunday. I'm so proud and excited to talk to the young ones. But there are many other universities and research all over NATO. It is my strong desire to encourage a conversation about innovation and security that will be in a way helping our political leaders, our business leaders, and our citizenry to be able to be ready to also absorb and contribute to such a conversation, because the risk there will be more and more of a gap between the power of comprehension of such complexities. And you see the discussions these very days about AI and its advanced learning machine processes. So I think it's a very important thing to educate the very young education, even younger than colleges, to go very young and very deep and also embody, because once you have educated and aware citizens, young citizens, that will be much easier for politicians or leaders, for the private sector to have talent to recruit from,
Yes.
from governments to have talent to recruit from, and also to have a democracy, a mechanism of democracy where we can have logical and informed decisions and not impulses based on fears. And I will mention also disinformation. This is something that it's very important for us. There is a huge use for many years of disinformation, of fake news. We see an intensification of these things against our interests in NATO countries, in the Republic of Moldova, as I mentioned before. So again, working with private sector that have huge tools also to anticipate fake news. And I think we have to find, and we are working NATO, EU, and the G7, we are working into this. And speaking of resilience, because you're ambassador to the OECD, we are also now starting a new partnership between NATO and the OECD on the double-faceted discussion about resilience and fragility of many of our partners, especially in Northern Africa and in Africa, in other places. So it is very important for like-minded institutions to work together. And this is something that I do.
This is fragility in terms of disinformation or more broadly? On everything.
On everything. We are now working. I met yesterday John Kerry. There will be a meeting in Brussels between him, Secretary General Stoltenberg, and Frans Timmermans, who is the #2 in the Commission dealing with climate change. There is a consequence of climate change on security. This is, of course, the climate change, which is a huge problem that we have to address, including in innovating in technologies. But there's security consequences of climate change. And NATO is very interested and is the natural place to be looking into this. So I'm closing this very broad conversation with the idea that there is a new definition of security: economic security, cybersecurity, resilience, fragility of our neighbors, disinformation. And NATO has an obligation, as we defend 1 billion people from 32 allies, to make sure that there is no weak link on any of the facets of a new definition of security. And cyber and digital, again, are the most horizontal issues that are basically making us strong or weak. And working with them and knowing how this administration engages with its allies all over the world, I'm pretty confident that will prevail.
So I wanted to ask you, there was, as Heather noted, there was an announcement this morning of a successful international effort that's called Medusa to take down a Russian malware network and share threat signatures. And I wanted to get your reflections on that, if you're willing to talk about it, and understand a little bit better how these kinds of efforts can scale to meet other state threats. And I guess just I'll to add one other thing to it based on some of the things you've been saying. I feel that one of the things you're hinting at is sort of an all of society approach to these issues. And I wonder if as we successfully take down these malware efforts or attack ransomware, we should be proud of ourselves, and how much are we educating our whole society about these efforts?
Yep. It's a really good question. So as with traditional weapons, there's a role for defense, there's a role for resilience, there's a role for ensuring that we are as secure as we need to be at home. And then there's a role for saying we need to build defenses against particular adversary weapons and capabilities and work to take them off the table if we can. Cyber is such an interesting space because it crosses borders. It's fundamentally transnational. All of us live in connected societies. So the operations that were announced, which were really months in the planning, were around a very capable, sophisticated set of Russian malicious code that was used to compromise machines around the world, we believe for espionage purposes, in, as I said, countries around the world and certainly in the United States. So the Department of Justice conducted operations to essentially clean up infected systems. And then the intelligence community, CISA, the Department of Justice, FBI, worked to release very detailed information about this Russian capability to enable the private sector, global cybersecurity firms who run on billions of servers and laptops and computers to find it and protect against it. So the three parts of that operation: one is the intelligence, right? To learn about an adversary's espionage and in some cases computer network attack capabilities. Second, to determine which are the ones that are being broadly used that represent a threat. The defensive capabilities to clean up systems that we know are infected, and then recognizing the private sector as a major partner to give them the information to hunt, find, and protect against this capability. And the key, not just in the United States, because we're committed to our allies and partners, but everywhere around the world as well.
No, this is not a NATO operation per se. This
Yes.
was not an attack against NATO assets or infrastructures, but it's a perfect example of what international cooperation and sharing intelligence and information amongst allies and partners do represent. Because this is not only about our national security system, this is about private sector. This is about, every citizen that is, could be in the situation to be affected by such malware. And the more we share, the better prepared we are. And also, we also are preparing, and Anne is leading the effort to making sure that we have a sort of a more common understanding of the forensics of such attacks. Because every national agency, each country is organized differently, they cope every second with things like this. And the moment you start developing, and this is something that we appreciate a lot coming from the US and from Anne personally and her colleagues, is that when you start identifying a sort of a common procedures for the national forensics, nobody says we share everything. It's impossible. But once we have a common understanding and a method and also a mechanism to address these things, then identification of the problem and the perpetrator is easier. And if politically we feel ready, like in the Albanian case, to make attribution collectively, it's far more powerful. Because it's one thing to have one or two, three individual nations naming one nation, which is the perpetrator, is a different thing to have NATO with all its might and all its volume to say that thing. So I believe that what we are doing now is helping every nation that is an ally or a partner to have a minimum of capabilities to be able to cope on its own, or when there is something too big, to be able to call upon friends and allies using the NATO, using bilateral things. And I think we're making big progress on this one too. And this is again something that we'd like to thank Anne and her team, because that's a huge added value for all the allies inside NATO.
And we work this all together, clearly. You're being very gracious. I will note the linkage between operations like these and the attribution we talked about.
Yes.
One thing that's changed is traditionally when we'd start these attribution discussions, no surprise, anybody observing them, it took us months to attribute any cyber attack in the past. And I think in the last couple of years, it's been very quick. And one key change we recognized was, in the past, we started with sharing the intelligence of why there was attribution among all the various different countries. And there would be the traditional back and forth of, oh, but there isn't enough intelligence being shared. Oh, we can't see every single step of it. So we paused and said, honestly, attribution is a way to enforce voluntary international norms. It's a political sovereign decision. If we do it by starting in intelligence and technical channels, those channels are doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is validating intelligence, seeing if they come to the same conclusions. But if you divorce it from the larger international foreign policy goal, which is a group of countries coming together to say, we must have norms in this critical space. And we now have those norms. We need to take it to the next step of countries reinforcing them by statements, and then eventually getting to then consequences, because all of this builds on itself. I always get asked the question of, so are we at the point of enforcing consequences? And I say, well, we're still at the point of everybody agreeing what these norms look like in practice, because translating words to bits and bytes takes some work and it takes some education. So folks understand and then understand the implications. So when we build trust in efforts like these, where information is shared, where we demonstrate that we're sharing whatever we know to enable all to defend, I truly believe it builds the trust towards doing things like attributions, getting the political buy-in to recognize that in as much as we're each doing our sovereign work to do our national defense and making commitments about cyber defense pledges and making, where we can, contributions to incident response communally in NATO, we build the muscle and the partnership to where we can then do attributions start to get to eventually enforcing those international norms that we must have in this space to have the confidence that we can protect our countries in crisis, work together in periods when needed to defend and deter in a real way.
So I'm going to ask you one final question to wrap up, and you can answer my question or add anything that you like. But I want to return to this idea of success, because what strikes me when I listen to both of you and when we reflect on Ukraine is that this is an enormous success, the progress that's been made on cybersecurity in terms of breaking down these silos that you both talked about, silos of the intelligence community, economics, foreign policy, technology, and also a success of cooperating among nations. So I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about where do we go from here, but also how do we communicate to our publics, to our societies, the kind of success that's been made, and the fact that an organization like NATO is now really addressing these cutting edge challenges of the 21st century, so that our publics can feel confident that these alliances are strong, that they're doing exactly what they would want them to do, and that they have a role to play, as you were saying, in terms of learning, getting ready for a job in cybersecurity or in technology, that is of national importance to them. So it's success, and then how do we build on it?
I'm happy to start. In any journey, it's important to mark a milestone where
Exactly.
success has been achieved, even as one recognizes so much more to go. Right? Kind of when climbing a mountain, you look up, but you also have to look back over your shoulder. So I want to emphasize that a lot has been accomplished in building that muscle. A lot remains to be done in terms of, for example, now that we have this incident response capability to be formally announced in Vilnius, to exercise it and to build capability so more and more countries are not only ready to draw from it, but are ready to contribute to it. And I mentioned similarly on the international norm space. I think as we look to emerging technologies, the Diana Innovation Fund is truly exciting because it goes to where there are communal funds to be invested in areas where NATO will benefit, and to talk about deepening that relationship with startups, with non-traditional private sector tech players, to enable NATO to really advance and implement the concepts in the broader strategic concept. When NATO was first started, 12 countries came together, kind of the ashes of the Second World War, to say, we want to build an alliance to make us all secure and to deter countries from starting the kind of conflict we've just suffered through. And I think it's exciting to think what's happened since that time. And it's exciting to think about, as new technologies of war, as new technologies of opportunity are available, how NATO is adapting to that.
I'm coming back to the first question on Ukraine. I think what we have done for Ukraine and what Ukrainians have done for themselves is nothing short of extraordinary. And I think we are still in the process of learning the lessons of sometimes strategically, sometimes ad hoc cooperation in helping Ukraine. And I have to thank here officially the technology companies that have been helping Ukraine. And I think without this cooperation between governments, NATO, individual nations, our citizens helping the Ukrainians in humanitarian ways and many ways, we would not be able to have such a fantastic resilience and bravery of the Ukrainians. I think the obligation we have is to have the lessons learned really absorbed in everything we do. We see there multi-domain operations. We see there how disinformation happens on attack on critical infrastructure. So that's a big learning curve. We are thinking now of establishing in Poland a center of NATO for lessons learned from Ukraine.
Wow.
And I think this is something that we should continue to build upon. And then, of course, this is not only about Ukraine, it's about what I would say the operation of trust building. For me, that's important as a political leader. Trust building between government and private sector, between government, private sector, and citizens, and also the trust in our values and in our norms. I know that the Vilnius summit, which will be bringing additional added value on cyber and innovation in what our leaders will decide. And then I'm already thinking, I'm always impatient, looking to the 75th anniversary summit of NATO in 2024, that will happen in the place where the whole beautiful journey of NATO started in Washington, D.C. So you see in me a sense of realism and concern, because that's a complicated world. It's complexity like we never had before in global affairs, ever in human society. But as I see how we are responding to this very complex situation, my trust in our organization and also in our values is becoming stronger. So we have to continue to work a lot. And I really cherish our partnership and our friendship, Anne. And I also want to thank also GMF again, also for proposing such bold ideas for the reconstruction of Ukraine, and being for so many long years a real avenue for keeping North America and Europe closer together. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts with us, and also for your leadership and your hard work and your successes. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.